Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. The Ukraine War Frontline update for the 16th of September 2024. I haven't done a mapping update for a good, I don't know, maybe 3 days apart from the Kursk update only. I didn't do the rest of the map, so what you will see on the map, and if you don't know what my lines mean on the map, please check out the key on the screen at the moment, pause the video. But yeah, there is quite a bit of movement. That will be 2 to 3 days worth of movement, so bear that in mind. Now, at the moment, as we speak, there are explosions at the Engels airbase, or near the Engels airbase. In fact, we're not quite sure exactly where, but Saratov has been targeted by the looks of it by Ukrainian something. Ukrainian drones probably, but explosions are taking place there. There could be some interesting news tomorrow, fingers crossed for the pro-Ukrainians out there. Okay, we're going to look at the Kursk incursion, invasion, whatever you want to call it, up here to the north of Ukraine. It's quite confusing around here because Surat maps, one of the maps I synthesized onto this map, he has his map showing a slightly different coloration here, signifying just the Kursk invasion area. Doesn't really mean anything other than that, so that's why it's slightly different color there. And you also have some other lines where the polygons, I could bore you with why we have to have these sort of polygons all over the map, but we do, and it can only take so many vertices. So these blue lines here, well, that one doesn't really signify anything, and you got basically the border along here. As you can see, the Ukrainians have there's a weird line there as well. Just follow that white line. That's where the border is. The Ukrainians have taken all this area, and as you can see, the mappers disagree somewhat, in some places quite a bit, on who controls what. So over here we have a good almost 5 kilometers of difference between Andrew Perpetua's mapping in blue, and that's a Russian defensive line there, and Surat maps that has the Russians having counterattacked and pushed further back in the north there. A little bit of difference on the west as well. Fairly in agreement on the east, a little bit of difference here and there. But what we're going to look at to begin with is, yes, okay, you can see that Russians are still pushing back in this area, taking that area. For Andrew Perpetua is saying that this area has been cleared. The Russians have taken that back. For Surat maps, it's more to the south of that western area that the Russians have taken back. If you draw an imaginary line connecting these Puce pins, that would be where the Russian lines previously were for the Kursk area for Surat maps. But we're going to go a little bit to the west here and have a look at what's going on along the border. So we've got Tetkino, and although there's no change to the Russian defensive line, it's worth noting that Andrew Perpetua does have some grey zone added in there. If I add in the grey zone, you can see it. That's the grey zone. So the Ukrainians have pushed into, there's a tiny bit of control here, pushed into Tetkino, or towards Tetkino there. So I think that's worth noting. And we also, because it's also thought that they control some of this land, the other side of the same river. So if you remember, the same river comes along the top of this, I don't know, I always call it sort of a rectangle. You've got a rectangle here, simply put, and you've got the same river coming along there, and then doglegging down here to Tetkino and into Ukraine. This side of the same river, on the western side, there's this area that's kind of cut off. It is Russian area, but the Ukrainians sort of appear to control much of that, as the Russians pulled back to the other side some time ago. And it could be that the Ukrainians are pushing up into Tetkino there. There's also a couple of places around the border here that the Ukrainians control, and they're pushing up into further to the north into Vesoloya. Now, the claims were yesterday, even though we don't have this as controlled on Andrew Perpetua's map, there are lots of claims that including from Russians, that the Ukrainians now can control Veseloye, Obukovka, and indeed Novi Put there. As far as grey zone on Andrew Perpetua's map, the grey zone is, if the map actually does what it's supposed to. No, it's not behaving. It does this. Oh, there you go. So you can see that Andrew Perpetua has quite a large grey zone here that stretches over this entire kind of two parts of these two different sectors of attack that the Ukrainians have pushing north across the border. Although, interestingly, doesn't have the whole of Veseloye as a grey zone, even though many have claimed that is not just a grey zone, it's actually controlled by the Ukrainians. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens with his mapping over the next 24 hours or so. Now, there is this second salient, if you want to call it a second one, separate one, in the Medvezhye area, where the Ukrainians have made some gains from their border, really over to this area. As according to Suryat maps here, that's why it's darker blue. And against the Suryat maps over here, that's under Ukrainian control, as they would claim. A much smaller area of control for Andrew Perpetua, of robust control. And then, as mentioned, this area over there. Now, there are claims that today the Ukrainians have taken control of Krasnooktobielsky there, and that's coming from a number of different sources too. So, okay, that's where we're at in sort of general terms. There are a number of other nuggets to let you know. So authorities in Russia's Kursk region have announced mandatory evacuation from Rilsk and Komutovsk districts. So Rilsk is one of these large areas. That's Rilsk there. And Komutovsky, I don't know exactly where that is, but there was a Komutovsk up there. Now this is where there were claims that the Ukrainians have pushed over the border the other day, but I haven't really heard anything since then. So it could be that this area has seen Russians evacuate, and that would indicate that there are a number of different places with activity. And this is one of the things I think the Ukrainians should be doing if they have enough troops. Of course, that's a massive if. Is just play whack-a-mole across the border, keep the Russians thinking, maybe even into Bryansk. Anywhere along this border where the Russians are the weakest compared to how the Russians are set up down the rest of the front line, with minefields aplenty, experienced Russian troops in position. Up here, it's less so the case, and that's why the Ukrainians had such success relatively easily into Kursk. They knew it was one of the weakest areas from the entire front line. In fact, it wasn't really the front line at all. They should just keep doing that in a number of places to keep the Russians absolutely sort of panicking and throwing as many troops as they can into these areas and dragging troops from elsewhere. Anyway, we'll look at some of these other sources. Now, I showed you this yesterday just to let you know that the Ukrainians are attriting quite a bit of Russian equipment in the area. Of course, the Russians are doing likewise to the Ukrainians, who are attacking as well. Both sides appear to be attacking. The Ukrainians still sort of pressing on the eastern side of this bridgehead, the Russians pressing on the west, and then the Ukrainians coming up from the south and then hitting the Russians' rear here. And so there's both sides are attacking in different ways. And when you attack, you generally lose more equipment than defensive forces. So yesterday there was a convoy of 14 armored vehicles of the Russian airborne troops on the way to storm Ukrainian positions, and the Russians lost 5 airborne combat vehicles, a tank, 1 APC, and several dozen troops. And then today there are more mechanized assaults taking place. This time in Lyubimivka. The outcome of the attack is currently unknown, but Russia definitely has presence. Says no reports in the close vicinity to the west. Now, Lyubimivka is here, where the Russians have possibly had some success. Where have you gone? Right on the edge. Where are you? You are here. I know you're here. Oops. Ah, there you go. Lyubimivka disappears. Sometimes if there are pins nearby, they can disappear. But that's where there's a lot of pressure from the Russians. They seem to be working hard to retake that settlement after they took Snagost back over here, and they appear to be in control of Obukovka just there. So yeah, large mechanized attacks. Don't know the outcome. Could be that the Ukrainians attrited a number of vehicles and repelled the attack, or the Russians could have pushed further forward. Right, when it comes to some of Noel reports' mapping, he says today there are strong reports that Ukraine has taken control over Krasno-Oktyabrski, so that's what it's saying, in the Kursk region, right on the Russian side of the border with Ukraine. Needs further confirmation, but the preliminary reports look legit and come from both sides. So that's that new, potentially new victory for the Ukrainians in terms of taking some Russian villages. And then what else do we have? Another confirmation of that, although it's transcribed differently there, but that is the Krasno-Oktyabrski. I don't know my Cyrillics too well, but that's pretty much what that is. Now, no reports their general thread for Kursk for the day contains a few interesting nuggets. So in the Kursk region near the village of Plakovo, Ukraine's 129th Territorial Defense Brigade repelled an attack by the Russian platoon. The Ukrainian soldiers reportedly forced them to retreat, and one of the fleeing groups was taken out by the brigade's FPV drone operators. Soldiers of the 95th Air Assault Brigade destroyed Russian equipment and ammunition east of Vesoloye in the Kursk region. So that's Vesoloye is this place that they may or may not control, the Ukrainians, but east of there is obviously somewhere in this vicinity. There were claims yesterday that the Ukrainians were advancing close to Glushkovko, not the one on the river, but a smaller one, I think, if it appears somewhere over here. Seems to have disappeared. Yeah, anyway, there's a couple of these, often, as is the case with Ukraine and indeed Russia, there are several place names that have the same name relatively close to each other. I can't find that other one, but it's basically something like the Glushkovko workers settlement. So it's somewhere else around here. But the point is that they may well have been moving further up here. There'll always be sort of advanced vanguards, deep reconnaissance groups, activity going on ahead of areas that the Ukrainians will robustly control, and that's the same for the Russians. Quite often with Surat maps is they will map that as being controlled by the Russians rather than understanding it's just maybe the vanguard or a tentative attack rather than controlling. Right, mandatory evacuation also talks about there by no reports in those two areas. FPV strikes on Russian equipment, BND blown up, airstrikes on Russian positions east on the eastern outskirts of Vesoloye in the Kursk region. So it's without knowing any geolocation of that, eastern outskirts of Vesoloye, if that is today, then that would indicate that the Russians still control parts of this if the Ukrainians are hitting it with airstrikes, but it could also be somewhere out here, like those facilities, not directly in the village itself. I just don't know. I mean, they do look like larger, sort of whitish buildings there, but yeah, I can't tell. I have seen some pretty devastating explosions and buildings. This is one of them actually. So the entire building collapses as the I presume the guided glide bomb hits it. Now that is a big building. Imagine if that is full of troops or has a command post in it. You know, nothing is likely surviving that. It gets absolutely destroyed. And when we talked about how devastating it was the other day that you had those strikes on the communications training place in, was it Poltava? No, or Pavlohrad actually. And the Ukrainians lost some 50 people, 58 I think it was the last count, 280 injured. These sort of attacks are happening on a daily basis for both sides, admittedly. I saw another HIMARS strike just now on Russian positions out in the forest, and there are quite a few dead bodies lying around, and they're just there are significant strikes taking place on both sides, leading to huge casualties on a daily basis. And we often go crazy about whole a building getting hit here because it's really significant. You kind of get a sense of the scale because it's a big building hit and 50 people dying. But actually, there's every chance that is happening in different places on the front line on almost a daily basis. So I'm certainly seeing a lot of guided glide bombs hit from both sides. So I don't know whether the Ukrainians have just got a lot more of those, are sending up more planes with them. They have more planes to hand to do that kind of activity, but it's certainly more footage of it coming out. Okay. Moving on to the last sort of Kursk bit here, the pontoon bridges over the River Seine still seem to be being built and being destroyed. 2 more bridges up as of 16th of September 2024, and whether they will still be up in a day's time, I guess we'll see. Here's an image of a number of the bridges that have been built and many that have been blown up across the same river. So it's this game, as MT Anderson says, of pontoon bridge whack-a-mole. Right, I am going to just go to George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War to give you a synopsis of... Actually, no, we'll leave that till the end. We'll do our video synopses from other sources at the end of this update. So that's Kursk for you. We have, interestingly, some grey zone has opened up here, and I hadn't noticed it. I don't know how long that has been there, but this is a grey zone in the in another area or across the border. Here, I presume that is just that is in the Belgorod region. So yeah, good news that the Ukrainians might well be trying out this game of cross border whack-a-mole, as I said previously. So good news there potentially. Now, when we come down to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna, down here, just some gains here around the Pischany area. So this is where the Ukrainians have this real problem on their hands, I think, because the Russians are getting closer and closer to the Oskil River, and the Russians are expanding that bridgehead, in this case northwards, giving a bit of extra ground there for the Russians. Not quite as much as Surat Maps has to the western side of that bridgehead, but yeah, it's pretty worrying, I think, that area for the Ukrainians. Then it's all really about the red and puce pins, pink and puce pins here, suggesting that the Russians are making quite considerable gains in a number of places. Now, first of all, this is the Bakhmut area, where we have Bakhmut there, Chasiv Yar here to its west, up here actually, and the Russians appear to be expanding control around the Kalinivka area and a tiny bit across the canal, at least as according to Surat Maps. There's quite a bit of a difference between the mappers, both around Chasiv Yar and also significantly down here towards the canal from the kind of Klishchivka, Ivanivska direction. But we'll come to that in a second. So just north of Kalinivka, the Russians have taken control, as according to Surat Maps and not Andrew Perpetua, taken control supposedly up to the canal and are pushing northwards. That's what you'd expect. I mean, if it has happened, it's not the end of the world. It's worrying if they are getting further purchase across the canal, but I don't know if that's definitely the case. And then down here around the Klishchivka area, Ivanivska area, the Russians really controlling an awful lot of more land than they were a few weeks ago, as according to Surat Maps. Andrew Perpetua admitting now that the Ukrainians have ceded, it seems, that whole trench network to the north of Klishchiivka, and this was really what it was all about. You could argue that that is the key to basically this whole area, really. This is an extensive trench network that is zigzagging all across the top of the hill, the ridge that overlooks Klishchiivka. So if you remember, Klishchiivka sits in on the low ground here. You've got high ground around here, and Klishchiivka itself has just been completely rubberized, while the trench line or the trench network on this hill is what everyone's really fighting over. Now, both mappers agree that the Russians do have control over that, and I think that's significant because that was holding out, it appeared, for quite a long time. And as you can see, you lose that, you lose all of this, and it appears that the Russians, even though Andrew Perpetua doesn't agree fully, it's probably likely that the Russians will push the Ukrainians all the way back to the canal, and that will probably happen all the way down the canal to Kurdyamivka. And that's not surprising. It's been amazing that the Ukrainians have been able to hold out as long as they have there. And now it appears that the Russians have taken back all the land that they lost after the Ukrainian counterattack, really. Where, if you remember, goodness me, it seems so long ago, the Ukrainians were pushed out of Bakhmut, and then they did some useful counterattacks particularly over in this direction. And this grey line is the November the 30th line for the Ukrainians, and they had gone all the way over to here, got across this railway line around Andriivka and Klishchiivka, and then the Russians have been slowly pushing them back, but really failed to get them back to the May the 30th, 2023 lines. And it seems like they're getting there now. There's only that pocket there, whilst they've also pushed way past the May the 30th lines further to the north by Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar. Okay, coming on down to the Prokros front, you can see that it is increasing in size for the Russians, but interestingly, no change to the entire north and to the northwest either. So that is good news. The Ukrainians have stopped them getting closer to Prokrovsk and stopped them closer for some time. They've stopped them closer, getting closer to the T0504 highway, connecting Prokrovsk to Konstantinivka up there. But the Russians are moving further to the south. They are looking to close off this pocket. Ukrainians, it was thought that they were pulling out of here. It doesn't look like that would be a nice place to hang out. And both mappers agreeing that the Russians are having some success south of Seledovo and around this mining town, it looks, of Ukrainsk. So Surat Mats has them taking land, all of this land, since the last time we mapped here, and a small amount just the other side of this spoilings heap by the looks of it. So that's one of these mining features of the landscape that can give defenders a good sighting across the landscape, but it also means that if you whack a mortar crew up the top there, they're going to stick out like a sore thumb, so you don't get a lot of cover. Anyway, when we come further to the east along this front line, Andrew Perpetua has the Russians taking quite a large area of land. This is Halitsnivka and Dolinivka there, and Zelene Perche is now under Russian control, as according to Surat maps. Bit of a difference between the two mappers there, but you can see the general trajectory for what's going on here. And the Russians are also pushing upwards from further to the south. So this is Marinka, Herivka, and if you think how difficult it was for the Russians to take any land previously, they really had to grind and grind and grind. And actually, if you see how successful they've been since May the 30th of 2023, this is a fairly decent amount of land. But, and there are some big buts here, it has come at immense cost. And actually, you'll listen to General Ben Hodges in a minute talk about he puts this all into context and says, well, for the second greatest army in the world to do that in 10.5 years is pretty rubbish, essentially. And he's got a point. But nonetheless, they are grinding on and taking land in the Mariinka area and onto Herivka and north of there as they try and close up that land between Mariinka and the Pokrovsk bridgehead or salient. Then, as we come further to the south, we get to the road that connects Pobieda down through Konstantinivka, this other Konstantinivka here, and then down all the way to Vuhledar. Slight gain, as according to Surat maps, just south of Vuhledar, just north of Pavlivka there, across the this river here, the Kashlahak River. But if we go up to this road, some fairly substantial gains for the Russians here. So around the Konstantinivka area, just to the south of there, some gains in the fields. And then further across the road, this is where Surat maps did have the Russian line. If you draw that imaginary line between the darker pins here, then you can see that the Russians have taken all of this land according to them, according to Surat maps, and then according to Andrew Perpetua, really quite significant amount of land all the way around here. And they fairly much agree, both the mappers, apart from this little area there, they fairly much agree with each other on what the Russians control. Now, I showed you a video this morning of a tall building, a very tall tower that was blown up by the Russians, and that was at this Pivdeno-Donbaska 3 coal mine. So this is definite evidence that the Russians are here. They've blown up this big sort of building above, I guess, the mine shaft. And they did that because apparently the mine shaft was mined by the Ukrainians. So that indicates that the Russians are there, which both mappers seem to agree on pretty much. But anyway, that's the situation around Vuhledar. I think Vuhledar is not long for Ukrainian control there. So that is what's happened on the eastern front line. Southern front line is, unsurprisingly, there's not a lot of movement there because I believe many of the troops from around here have been moved up to the Kursk region to defend up there. A couple of points I didn't make earlier concerning the Kharkiv region, so we'll go up to there for just a quick second. So first thing I'll mention is around the eastern area of Vovchansk. Eastern Vovchansk has almost returned to the Ukrainians. Russian efforts to save Kursk are opening up vulnerabilities elsewhere. So that is possibly around this kind of general area. The other thing I've heard tonight is that the Russians are shelling this this aggregates plant here, and if they are shelling that, it means that their troops aren't there. And this is the area that the Russians have apparently been surrounded for goodness knows how long now. Probably indicates that they are no longer there if the Russians are shelling that. So it could be that we see a change to the mapping in this area over the next day or so. We'll see if the mappers reflect that. The other thing is Ukrainian troops in Kharkiv region claim they blocked more of Russia's troops, says Tim White. They say in the villages of Lyobeke and Lipsy, a catastrophic situation has developed for the occupiers due to the extremely high activity of Ukrainian drones, saying they have to return home. So that's in this area, having some trouble around the Lyobeke and Lipsy area there. Anyway, I thought I'd throw that one in. Now we'll go to George Barrows from the Institute for the Study of War, who's going to talk about sort of Kursk and Pokrovsk and sort of troop numbers and whatnot.
Every single day, we're studying in minute detail how the contours of the Ukrainian front line is changing. And it ebbs and flows. The rate of advance for the Ukrainians definitely has slowed over the last month, especially in the last 2 weeks. And when we collect geolocated data and other parts of information, we see that the Russians have succeeded in taking back very small pieces of territory on the periphery, and territory continues to change hands. So it seems to be consolidating, it seems to be stabilizing. I think net the Ukrainian gains are still slowly going up there, but it's actually become a lot less interesting. And I suspect that we're actually not going to see a drastic change in the size of the salient,
That might have been
barring either
recorded.
belligerent deploying a significant large amount of forces. The Ukrainians
Might have been recorded before the Russians had done significant counterattacks. I can't speak to the time that this was recorded, even though it only came out yesterday.
have some brigades in a reserve that they've not yet committed. It remains a question where the Ukrainian command will use them. Will they use them to reinforce Donetsk and the Donbass and Pokrovsk, or will they send them to Kursk to do something there? We don't know. The Russian response, as for them, they've decided to not, massively introduce reserve forces into Kursk. They've deployed, the estimates vary from 20 to 30,000, perhaps a little bit higher number of forces. But the U.S. intelligence community assesses that in order to remove the current salient that the Ukrainians have, the Russians need 50,000 forces. And the Russians, by all indicators, have not sent that. I mean, they've sent maybe half of that. So they've sent enough to stay.
Interesting. So George Barros reckons the Russians have sent 25,000 to there. We heard Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainians, say that 30,000 have been sent there. And that was some time ago. Then we had Zelensky saying that 60 to 70,000 was what the Russians were wanting to send there. It's unclear whether he was saying that's what they had sent there or whether that's what their intentions were. So different numbers being thrown around with regard to the Russian forces being thrown into Kursk.
Stabilize it, slow the Ukrainian advance, and maybe tactically retake a couple villages here or there in the periphery, but not remove it. And what we know is that, look, the Russians, they really don't want to tap into the main combat force that they have in Pokrovsk. Just to give it a sense of scale, right now, the Russians in the direction of Pokrovsk, they have at least 2 combined arms army, maybe 3 combined arms armies to conduct this major operation. There's the 41st Combined Arms Army, which is sort of the main element. That's from the Central Military District in Siberia. And then you have the Donetsk People's Republic proxy forces, which were just recently reorganized. They had been called since 2014, the Donetsk, First Army Corps. That recently was reorganized into another Combined Arms Army. It's now called the 51st Combined Arms Army. And then there's a 3rd Combined Arms Army, which is operating in the area as well, the 3rd. And so when you think of the scale, right, and none of these Russian armies are actually up to their doctrinal end strength. A Russian Combined Arms Army, generally speaking, is about 50,000 people on paper, depending on its composition and what kind of units it's staffed with. But on paper, these are organizations that have 50,000 people, right? I'm confident that it's lower than that because all of these Russian units are operating below their doctrinal end strength. But this is a tremendously large amount of combat power. 2 Combined Arms Armies, 3 Combined Arms Armies to put behind a town with a population of, a pre-war population of, 60 or 70,000 people. And if you look at how the Russians have advanced in the direction of Pokrovsk since the beginning of this year, or even from the front lines as it existed from 2014, what the Russians started with in 2022.
The purple lines there.
With 3 Combined Arms Armies and, now 9 months of campaigning this year, they've managed to advance, in total some, 30, 35 kilometers or so from where the initial Russian line was near Avdiivka. That's not terribly great performance. And we know the Russians are isolating those armies and trying really hard to not send anything from there to the Kursk group. So
this is a really important point because I was saying that this is a really significant amount of land that they've taken. But as he says, that's 3 combined arms armies in 9.5 months or whatever it's been, I'd say since October last year. So I'd say it's 11 months really. And that's what they've achieved at tremendous losses. It isn't all that impressive. And it's really easy to be quite doomy about Pokrovsk. But in the grand scheme of things, Pokrovsk is kind of doing what Bakhmut did, which is massively attrit Russian forces. Bakhmut, like I've said before, was a success for the Ukrainians. Now they've lost that land, okay, but what happened? Wagner were defeated, and it really essentially led to Prigozhin dying. That was a success of Bakhmut. It was incredibly attritional for the Russians. Now, the question was, did the Ukrainians hold on too long? Was it a little bit too attritional for the Ukrainians at the end? But in general, I think it did its job. That you could argue Prokofsky is doing to some degree for the, well, very much so for the Russians here, because they have lost, and verified losses here, over 5-1 Russian material losses to Ukrainian losses. This is one of the most attritional areas that is being counted along the front line. It has been incredibly painful for the Russians.
That seems to be the decision that the Kremlin has leaned into for now, and I'm pretty confident that unless the Russians make a major decision, mobilize a lot of forces, deploy a large group, substantially re-engineer the way that they're currently fighting the fight at the theater level, I think that Ukrainian salient will likely survive through the winter.
Putin does clearly have
So
concerns
interesting.
because
So he thinks that will survive through winter. This is what, on a similar sort of theme, this is what General Ben Hodges has to say.
next. But I am uneasy that there is so much talk and there's so much influence by people back in Washington that have been clamoring, saying that there's no way Ukraine can win. Come on, we need to get to a negotiation. And I'm like, can you look at a map? How can you say that there's no way Ukraine can win, that after 10 and a half years, Russia controls only 18% of Ukraine? They've lost 600,000 troops. The Black Sea Fleet, no longer a factor. The Russian Air Force has failed its two most important tasks. If we got serious about winning, we would have already stopped Russia from being able to export oil through the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea to China and India. No Iranian missiles would ever reach Russia. So if we were serious about those things, we'd be having a whole different conversation. So I am uneasy that there still are too many voices that say we need to get to a resolution soon, and that
Interesting. And actually, when you look at the whole context and the bigger picture, like I've said to you before, like Russia have been very underwhelming in what they've achieved, and Ukraine have done an amazing job, and the West has done a good enough job of supporting Ukraine, but not a brilliant job. And in fact, if we'd done a brilliant job, Russia would have lost this already. But we are dragging our feet, and we are not allowing Ukraine to fight with both its hands. We are putting restrictions on Ukraine that is just not helping them to victory as much as, we're just not helping as much as we could and as much as we certainly should. Anyway, that's enough for me. Take care, guys. I'll speak to you soon.